Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Liberty.me live event. We have a wonderful event this evening. We are talking about Bitcoin. I am your co-host, Steve Patterson, and I am joined with my fellow co-host and brother, Sam Patterson.
Hey,
and
everybody.
together, we are called the Bitcoin Brothers, appropriately enough. We are joined this evening by probably the most entertaining economist on the planet, who also happens to be a karaoke singer, Mr. Bob Murphy. Thanks for being here, Bob.
Thanks. At first, I didn't know who you were talking about, but the karaoke, I thought it had to be me. So
It's a good guess.
Bob wrote a book called Understanding Bitcoin, which is an excellent introduction to Bitcoin. You can find it in the Liberty.me archives, and that's what we're going to be talking to him about tonight. But before we dive into Bitcoin, why don't we first just introduce ourselves very briefly, just a few sentences, who you are, what you do, and maybe how you got interested in Bitcoin in the first place. So why don't we start with you, Sam?
Great. So I have been interested in Bitcoin since probably mid-2012. Probably like a lot of people who are interested in Bitcoin today in this space, is because I had a lot of libertarian friends who were kind of obsessed with it, and they kept hounding me to research it further. At first, I thought, it doesn't have intrinsic value and gold. But eventually, I finally studied it enough and had enough people that I really respected who kept pushing me that I began to see the value of it. And in doing that research, I recognized that there wasn't actually a great one-stop shop for information on Bitcoin yet at that point. And so I decided to write it myself, and I wrote the Bitcoin Beginner book in early 2013 that sort of started all this. And then later on down the road, I actually am a co-founder of a company that's building a Bitcoin product, which I can talk about later, called Open Bazaar, to build a decentralized network for trade. So that's how I am involved in the Bitcoin space.
Excellent. Bob, what about you?
Sure. So hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Let me just acknowledge, I realize there's a weird camera angle here. I'm trying to show the majesty of Bitcoin. I'm looking down upon you from the heavens. And as far as my background, I am a professional economist. I taught at the college level for a few years. I'm now at Texas Tech, the Free Market Institute here in Lubbock, Texas, doing research. And I'm a big fan of the Austrian School of Economics. I have been doing a lot of work. I've written study guides on the great Austrian thinkers Mises and Rothbard and their major works. And so a lot of what I dealt with was monetary theory. And so naturally, and I'm also, of course, a political libertarian, an anarcho-capitalist, to be more precise. And so when Bitcoin came on the scene, people kept asking me about it in the beginning. I didn't know what the heck it was, and I started looking into it. And what ended up happening was, I didn't know enough about the cryptography and things like that, and public key signatures and so forth, to really just learn it straight and directly from what it was. And so I was relying on people's analogies, but I could just tell they weren't quite right. Like, what they were saying didn't make sense, and I would ask questions like, well, yeah, that's because the analogy. So I set out on a quest to really understand it myself, just to know the economics of it. Like when people would ask me, does it violate Mises' regression theorem, or is it better than gold? I needed to know how the thing worked to answer the economics behind it. So I teamed up with Silas Barta, who had built a mining rig in his house and so forth, and he knew he was very sharp mathematically. And so he and I just kept going back and forth until he explained to me how the protocol worked, that I thought I knew it well enough that I felt comfortable answering the economics. And at that point, I said, you know what? We went through all this hard work of you teaching me how it works. Why don't we write this up? Because I'm sure other people could benefit from it. So I would like to say, if you're new to it, understanding Bitcoin has, I think, it assumes nothing and then takes you as deep as you want to go to have a good understanding. It teaches you enough math along the way, and you can take it as deep as you want to get a feel for how it works.
Excellent. And I am Steve Patterson. I am the author of What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin, which is also an introductory book. It's a bit less technical than either Sam or Bob's work. It's just kind of the concepts that I try to write it for grandma. So if you have a grandma that's like, I don't understand Bitcoin, but she can read, she can probably understand the concepts after reading that book. I also am a writer and author and philosopher by trade. Sam, what were you going to say?
No, I didn't mean to interrupt your intro. I was just going to add, my book at this point is severely outdated, so I strongly recommend that you go and read either Bob or Steve's book, or maybe even both of them instead of mine. Just want to throw
That's a
it
great
out
idea.
Oh,
Well, okay.
there's also a Liberty.me primer on the topic of Bitcoin, which is called Up and Running with Bitcoin that I wrote, and that's just meant to be not an explanatory text of Bitcoin, but like how do I get started with this stuff? So that would be interesting if folks want to get off the ground. And I believe Bob's book is also posted on Liberty.me as well. So
Yeah.
a great resource for all of these texts about Bitcoin.
Yes, all of them are in the Liberty.me archives. So we have 3 Bitcoin authors that are ready to go this evening. So let's just jump right in. Bob, the subtitle of your book is The Liberty Lover's Guide to the Mechanics and Economics of Cryptocurrencies. So why is it that you chose to write this book specifically geared towards liberty-friendly folks?
Sure. So good question. And Silas and I, again, my co-author Silas Barta, we debated that because we thought on the one hand, you know, a lot of what we have to offer is just explaining it neutrally, put ideology, politics aside. How does the thing work? And we thought we did a pretty good job, and so we thought that would give us a broader market. I mean, we posted the thing for free. It's not like we were charging money for it, but we thought it would get more currency, no pun intended, if we did that. But on the other hand, I was concerned that if it just had a real bland title, people might not realize that it's undeniable a lot of the people who were involved in the development, you know, things that came before Bitcoin that, you know, were drawn upon in terms of developing it, and then certainly many people seeing what this could do, it had a lot of implications for people who were concerned about the power of states around the world and individual liberty. So I thought, you know, instead of trying to please everybody, let's really, you know, just talk to the group that we think we have the most to say to. And plus, a lot of the objections and questions I was going to handle in the economics sections were coming from people who were concerned about the state and inflation and things like that. So it just kind of naturally fell into place that was our primary audience.
Right. Okay, so all 3 of us have written introductory texts on Bitcoin, and I'm curious to take sort of our pulse here and ask how well do we feel the Liberty audience community understands Bitcoin, and also the follow-up question is the mainstream. But I'm interested first, like, have we, not maybe us specifically, but has the movement itself really come to understand and embrace Bitcoin, or do we feel like we still have a ways to go to get that information out there?
Sure. So I'll go first. My sample is biased perhaps, but I think the Liberty community in general, everybody certainly has heard about Bitcoin. They have a vague idea of what it is and how it works. And I certainly know, like in New Hampshire, a lot of those people use it. You know, they actively try to minimize the use of money, like you know, fiat currency and Federal Reserve notes and so forth. I can't speak in terms of percentages of the overall, you know, people who self-identify as a libertarian, but I would imagine it's pretty high among them compared to almost any other non-arbitrary demographic you could come up with. So I do think, put it this way, I don't think if there's a problem with adoption of Bitcoin by a certain group of people among self-identified libertarians, I don't think the problem is they just haven't heard about it. I think if anything, it would just be the logistics, and you know, it makes more sense to use it when other people are using it in that sort of constraint.
What about the general public at large? What do you think? If you were to take the pulse of your average person, do you think they're completely ignorant, or?
Yeah, I think so. To a first approximation, I was on a plane once when I was working on the manuscript of our book, I think, and the lady next to me asked me what I was doing, and I said, and she was, oh, and she was with some financial institution, like some, you know, Citibank or something, and her team was like, heard about it and kind of wanted to know a little bit more just so they would know what they were talking about. But I don't, in my mind, I don't think that many sort of normal people really know what it is or how it works.
Yeah, I have to agree with that sentiment. I think we're all libertarians, and we're all a bit biased and insular. But in my own experience in talking to libertarians, it seems like 95% of them 99% of them have heard of Bitcoin, and a significant percentage of those are pretty supportive of it. I know, like, the most well-known skeptic I can think of is somebody like Peter Schiff, who accepts Bitcoin for his company, and I think he would identify himself as a libertarian, and he has a very sound understanding of economics, and he's still more on the hesitant end of the libertarian spectrum. But I also agree that I think the general public, either they are, I don't want to say ignorant in a pejorative sense, but they don't know what Bitcoin is, or if they've heard of it, they associate it with a bunch of bad things, drugs and the Silk Road and all sorts of bad things that people, bomb throwing anarchists use, and it's this, or terrorists, heaven forbid.
Ponzi scheme side
or
of
it's a Ponzi scheme, exactly.
Yeah, if I just quickly, I think the people in the general public, if they've even heard of it, would think it's like PayPal. I think that's probably what they think it is.
Yeah.
PayPal for terrorists.
Yeah.
That's not a good slogan there.
Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you guys. I agree with you, so I want to expand more on that. So let's actually get back into the book itself and talk about some of the economics behind it. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, Bob, and ask you a question that's not specifically about Bitcoin, but obviously it's very important, and you talk about this in your book. Why is it that we need privately created money? Because we've just witnessed in the past couple generations hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions, lifted out of poverty around the world. And that's during an era of very tight central banking with fiat currency. So why are we risking this progress by gambling on these sort of unproven private monies like Bitcoin?
Sure. So, and again, I acknowledge you're playing devil's advocate there. The fact that so many people have come out of, I mean, there were lots of things that were happening. I could say, well, there was a lot of CO2 emissions over the last 100 years. So clearly, we got to, if we want to keep raising people out of poverty, and so you can't just look at mere correlations. You have to look, have some sort of theory to try to explain what caused what. And so here, I would say, yeah, the reason so many people around the world have seen their standards of living go up, it's because of the connection of world markets, the spread of it's not laissez-faire capitalism, but certainly the spread of property rights. I mean, the things that are happening in China, that's because they pulled back from the sort of terror under Mao Zedong and so forth, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, things like that. So it's that's what I would say. It's not that, it's because of fiat money and central banking imposed by states that we had the prosperity we've had in the last 50 years or what have you. It's because of the spread of markets. And certainly in more advanced countries, I think you do see the rate of growth is not what it used to be, and there it's because they've swung the other way on the pendulum. So that's my general rah-rah free markets, private property for human living standards. And then so as far as privately created money, I think just as most people would recognize, you wouldn't want the state in charge of the newspapers, you wouldn't want the state running all of education. Now some people are more tolerant of that, but most people recognize like the state literally controlling all curricula and what's in all the textbooks. Even your left liberal would probably pull back from that and go, oh yeah, that makes me a little uneasy. By the same token, then what's something extremely important is the money, and why would you want to give a monopoly state the power to control that? So people who are anti-war, well, the last thing in the world you want is a central bank run by the state, because now they can just create money, and that's how they can fund their wars, and so things of that nature. So as far as restraining the arbitrary power of the state apparatus, take away the printing press. That's an incredibly important thing to do. And then historically, again, coming from the tradition of Austrian economics, one of their contributions is to show how money arose spontaneously. We don't have time for it in this venue, but the idea that there was some wise king sitting around, everyone was doing barter, and he just had an idea, say, hey, you know what? If you all, on one half of every transaction, we use these shells that nobody likes for anything, but you had to trade, buy and sell everything against these shells, we could be so much more efficient. He would sound crazy that people only after the fact could kind of study this money thing and figure out what it was. It arose spontaneously through voluntary transactions. So I would say money emerged from the market, and the state only later co-opted it and monopolized it. And as in every other realm, that was not a good move historically.
That's a that's an excellent answer, a very Austrian economics answer, which brings up probably the most popular nerdy objection to Bitcoin, economic theory-wise, has to do with the regression theorem. This is very much, I think you put it in your book, it's very much inside baseball, that the regression theorem is, there's a handful of people that get really worried about it, and everybody else is like, what are you talking about? Bob, could you just give an explanation of what the regression theorem is, and maybe how Bitcoin relates to it, and why people would correlate the two, and then what your own kind of analysis is?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll try to, again, we go through this at greater length in the book, but I'll try to give a quick version. And this, in fairness to the critics, part of why I focus on this is I want people who are libertarian and vague fans of the Austrian school to understand why there is this hostility among some Austrians, like Peter Schiff, for example. So what I'm going to explain here largely explains why it is that you would think normally, how come somebody who's an Austrian libertarian wouldn't just love Bitcoin wholeheartedly? They might think it's a bad investment or something, but wouldn't they just love the idea? So what I'm going to explain here sort of sheds light on why there was this bump in the road, as it were, before a lot of Austrians would embrace Bitcoin. So the way standard Austrian theory explains money, and I taught this in college classes, it's in my study guides of Austrian economics, is to say that originally, before the money existed, there were goods and people traded, and then some things people began to accept certain items not because they were going to use them directly, but because they realized other people might like them. All right, so if you go to town with a telescope, you're trying to sell it, and you want to get some eggs, it's going to be hard to find someone who has eggs and wants a telescope. And so you might give your telescope away for a cow, knowing, I don't want a cow, but I'm going to find someone who has eggs and wants a cow more than a telescope, right? So you're trading up for liquidity, things that are more saleable or marketable. And so once you get that idea, you can see how the ball would start rolling, or there'd be a snowball effect, and things would then, people would accept them because they were so liquid, because they were so marketable. And then once that would happen, it would multiply, and eventually one or two goods would be accepted by just about everybody. And so it would be kind of this odd situation where, oh yeah, everybody accepts that in trade because everybody accepts that in trade. And that's what money is, something everyone's willing to accept. But for that story to work, in the beginning, the thing had to be valued for direct uses, right? You wouldn't just pick up something that nobody liked and say, hey, everyone, let's all agree to use this. It was like a spontaneous step-by-step evolution. So, and that's the way, and I still believe that's true. Historically, where did the first money come from? So if that's how you teach monetary theory to undergrads, and that's how you're thinking about it, and Mises went so far in some of his writings to say, this isn't an exact quote, but things like, it's inconceivable that there could be a money that wasn't first used, for direct purposes besides its value as a medium of exchange. That's like the technical term for something you take because you're going to trade it away. Okay, so in that context, you can see how Bitcoin comes along, and it's not obvious, was there something Bitcoin was good for besides its role as a medium of exchange? And so therefore a lot of Austrians in the beginning were skeptical, saying this will never get off the ground. And then now to this day, there's still some diehards saying, I don't care how many people are using it, it's not money. It can't be by definition. And so that's the traditional standoff or what have you, or apparent problem. So my reaction is twofold. Is one is to say it's ambiguous exactly what Mises meant. So I'm sorry. There's two ways to handle it. One way is to say Mises was right and Bitcoin's fine because we can come up with ways to explain how it was useful besides just its role as a medium of exchange. And people have different theories, like a payment system and so forth, and that's fine. Another route is just to say, look, whether or not, and so for sure I would say, if you think that Mises was saying Bitcoin could never be accepted widely by people, well then he's wrong. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying Mises is wrong. I'm just saying if that's your understanding, he already is demonstrably wrong, right? Bitcoin's not a money yet, but Mises wasn't talking about something being used as a money. He was saying to even be used as a medium of exchange at step one, it had to have a prior use and some other direct use. So clearly Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, that some people accept Bitcoin not because they're going to go make a sandwich with it, but because they're going to trade it away, right? Everybody who accepts Bitcoin is doing it for that reason. So clearly it's a medium of exchange. And so the regression theorem was really talking about a medium of exchange, not money per se. And so if you think the regression theorem, that's the name for Mises' ideas on this, if you think that rules out Bitcoin ever becoming a money, it also would rule out Bitcoin being a medium of exchange, which I think just empirically is false. So that's kind of my take on it.
So I have kind of two half questions on this topic, because I think this is a really interesting one, because I happen to be a libertarian nerd as well. First is, do you think it's kind of inappropriate to use the regression theorem as a litmus test to say, is this money and currency or is it not? Because from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's more of a historical tool, a historical analysis, than it is like judging whether or not something is a viable currency, right?
So that's a good question. Let me. I don't know if I'm going to totally answer, but let me just say this: that the function of the regression theorem, and I realize we don't want to get bogged down too much here in the weeds. The problem was we had the subjective value theory, right? So Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, he got rid of the old classical labor theory of value, which would explain the value of goods in the marketplace based on how many labor hours were in the goods. He got rid of that and said, no, people value goods based on their marginal utility to the consumer. Okay, and everybody, economists loved that, and they adopted that framework. Okay, great. But they still resisted applying that new framework to money because it looked like you were arguing in a circle. It looked like you were saying, because you say, oh, well, why would I give up something I like a pizza or my labor power or what have you, or a house for money while using marginal utility? You say, oh, because the money gives me utility. Okay, why does money give me utility? Oh, because I can buy stuff with it. So it looks like you're just arguing in a circle. It looks like you're saying the reason money can buy things is because money can buy things. And so many economists were hesitant to take this new subjective value theory and apply it to money, and Mises solved that problem by saying, no, really what's going on is money has purchasing power right now because we expect it will in the future. And where do we get those expectations from? It's because we observed its purchasing power in the recent past. And so he's explaining money's purchasing power right now by reference to its purchasing power yesterday, let's say. And so then you just keep going back in time. So in order to logically close that loop and not just have an infinite regress, you have to have a starting point. You have to have somewhere where the way you're explaining why this thing has purchasing power, and you say, oh, because it gave somebody utility directly the way an apple directly does. And so it's not that historically, it's not that they found archaeological records or anything to verify, oh, look at it, it's Menger was right, money emerged from barter. That's not, it was more of a logical thing that there was a gaping hole in the argument if you had to just keep going back forever. And so he had to stop it somewhere, and the way to stop it was to say there must have been a point when everyone valued goods directly for the uses they would give to the person, and then once you had that as a basis, you could piggyback on that and say, oh, wait a minute, if I see that Joe Smith over there values apples because he likes the taste, well, then I'd be willing to accept an apple in trade even though I hate apples because I know I can give it to Joe Smith and get what I want.
Right.
But if you didn't know Joe Smith liked apples in the first place, that couldn't get off the ground.
Okay,
so that's where it came from, and that was the function it served. So it was more of a theoretical thing, even though it was like a theory about time passage.
Okay, so last question on this topic, because I know this is related to people in the Liberty movement, probably only related to people in the Liberty movement.
There's people on a Friday night that are just spellbound at this point.
So this is the question. This is something I'm puzzled by, because if we were to take the skeptical position and say, oh, Bitcoin can't be a currency because of the regression theorem, what would I be wrong if I were to say the following proposition? The reason that Bitcoin was first valued was because of human capriciousness, because somebody thought it was novel. They thought it was a neat idea, and so they thought, what the heck? Wouldn't something so trivial solve the regression theorem?
I think so, but it's almost like I think you're doing more than you have to. So my position is to say people are now accepting Bitcoins, as media of exchange. And so if you're coming along and telling me, no, they must not be, you're just wrong. They are. It's like if you come up with some way to prove humans can't possibly escape the Earth's gravitational field, you have some logical proof, I don't have to explain rocket science to you. I could just say, no, we did, and so there's something wrong with your argument. And so the same thing here. So yes, we can, if you want, try to, as historians or amateur historians or psychologists, get in the minds of the people who accepted the first Bitcoins. Because the problem is, and the idea is to say, so here's what I think partly what was going on is, the first Bitcoins were accepted with extremely low purchasing power.
Right.
You know, like how many they gave up for a pizza or whatever. And so I think part of the issue is, you're right, they just did it on a lark, like, why not? It's fun. Yeah. And maybe in the back of their mind they had this, they knew there's a 0.0001% chance this takes off and I'll be rich. So who cares? You know, so I think that's partly how it got the ball rolling. But the point is, whatever your explanation is for what happened those first few trades, they did happen. Right. And so if you're trying to put all your weight on this theoretical point that no, it couldn't have happened, well, it did.
Yeah, just use your eyeballs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so another question about sort of Bitcoin classification. Something I noted in your text that might be a little counterintuitive to people listening is Bitcoin fiat currency?
Great. Yep. So these are the best nerdy questions you guys are throwing at me here. This is great stuff. So
the Bitcoin brothers.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So my answer would be yes, and this is sort of, you know, like when Ron Paul was asking Bernanke, is gold money? You know what the answer was expected. So let me explain to libertarians, and they get up in arms. It is true that there is a general overlap between the term fiat money and bad money, or money, you know, put at people with a gunpoint, or money I don't like, that kind of stuff, money that's not natural. So, but in terms of the actual definitions, in terms of monetary theory that Mises and others used, what fiat money means is it's something that there are sort of arbitrary characteristics that separate the money from the non-money in order to establish scarcity so that it can function as a money. And so like a commodity money like gold, if you have an ounce of gold, no one has to come along and put special markings on it, right? Like a gold coin, under the classical gold standard, a gold coin that was stamped and so forth from some certain mint, it's not the stamping and the identification that made it money. That was just to help people identify that this really is an ounce of genuine gold, so they didn't have to do, you know, tests on it and so forth. But an ounce of gold was money, period, wherever you got it from. Whereas, you know, like U.S. currency right now, it's not that, oh, it's a green piece of paper. You know, it has to be issued officially by the mint and so on. So by the same token, there's nothing about Bitcoins per se in any non-arbitrary sense that makes one a valid Bitcoin and one not valid. It's just that's something built in to establish the scarcity. So in that respect, I would say yes, it is a fiat currency, but of course, here's where the traditional overlap, I think, diverges, where, yeah, you can imagine a fiat currency that's voluntarily issued and so on. One example or analogy, Friedrich Hayek had a proposal in the pamphlet, The Denationalization of Money, where he imagined competing issuers of paper fiat currencies. And so they couldn't compel anyone to use their notes. He just imagined these private agencies that would issue different units of currency, you know, pieces of notes, pieces of paper, and then, you know, there would be profit incentive for them not to print too much, and they, you know, they'd want to prevent counterfeiting and so on to protect their brand name. And he imagined the economics of that. So there, you know, if that system could work, that would be privately issued fiat currency that's kind of like the ones we picture today. So I think the real problem with state-issued fiat currency is the monopoly element and the fact that they have legal tender laws and stuff like that and can compel people to use them. Strictly speaking, you know, I'm a big fan of gold and silver, by the way, commodity monies.
Yeah.
And so, but in terms of, you know, libertarian theory, where I think the real issue is forcing people to use something, and so there you could just say empirically, people who are for commodity money and against all fiat money, period, would just have to predict in a totally free market nobody would use fiat currencies, whether they're private or state-backed.
Yeah, and there's a section in my book where I deal with the question of Bitcoin being unbacked. So there's a very legitimate worry that people have, oh, well, Bitcoin is unbacked, therefore it's as reliable as paper money. And the issue isn't necessarily the unbacking of a currency. It's that unbacked currencies have a tendency historically to be easily inflated. So it's not just that they're unbacked by anything, it's that they're really easily inflated. And in this, we can come up with a hypothetical scenario. We can imagine a currency not backed by anything and yet not able to be arbitrarily inflated. And it just so happens that that currency is Bitcoin, that it's this really unique, almost unprecedented mixing of the two. Do you have a opinion on whether or not you think the backing, or as some people might say, intrinsic value of or intrinsic use value of a Bitcoin, do you think that that is something that is preferable, or do you think that Bitcoin just doesn't need it, or it's something that's arbitrary, optional?
Right. Okay. Great question. So let me just throw a few points out in response. So I think you're right. The idea of backing, and again, with all this stuff, we're going to be real anal and talk about the specific language they're using and criticize. When Peter Schiff says, "Hey, it's not backed up by anything or has no intrinsic value," I'm sure if Peter Schiff and I had a 20-minute conversation, we would agree that there's no such thing as intrinsic value. Period.
Right,
we know what he means and he's getting at. So I don't want to come off as being too nitpicky. But strictly speaking, yeah, there's no such thing as intrinsic value. Everything is ultimately subjective. And you're right. The problem with fiat currencies issued by the state is not so much that they're not backed. It's just the fact that they can print unlimited quantities. And some people would say, well, that's two sides of the same coin. Again, no pun intended. And it largely is. But look, gold's not backed by anything, right? What do I get in exchange for my gold? Well, nothing. You have the gold. And so then they say, yeah, but we can use gold for stuff and whatever. And this is one of, in terms of why might Bitcoin in some sense be a harder currency even than gold and silver, is the scarcity is mathematically built in, right? It's theoretically possible an asteroid's going to crash that has all kinds of gold in it, or that humans are going to land on some asteroid and mine quantities of, and so that gold becomes as easily accessible as copper down the road, or even more, in which case it wouldn't function well as a money. So even if you had a market built on that, whereas Bitcoin, again, so long as there's nothing in the protocol that we haven't anticipated, that's more mathematically guaranteed to be scarce. One other point on all this stuff is that I throw out to Austrians, and even in the Austrian tradition, and I have in the guide, Understanding Bitcoin, some quotes from, I think, Mises and Rothbard on this point. They admit, so they were huge gold fans, obviously, commodity money, and they admitted that in the future, if everyone's using gold as money, and let's say for some reason the industrial uses of gold, just because of technological change or whatever, withered away, would it be sustainable at some future date that everyone's just using gold coins only because they're money, not because at that point gold's good for anything else? Mm-hmm. And they both said, yeah. So, if the libertarian Austrian theory from the giants allows for that, well then clearly I think if we ever got to the point where the whole world was using bitcoins as money, the fact that you couldn't use them also for dental fillings wouldn't blow the whole thing up. It wouldn't say, oh no, it's all a big Ponzi scheme, because if gold all of a sudden lost its industrial uses and no one liked it as jewelry, but it was still used because it was money, at that point, using some of these critics' terminology, gold would be a giant Ponzi scheme, with no floor.
Right. I always thought that was kind of a funny objection when you say, okay, well, gold has a value, you should do something with it. It's like, okay, you personally, what can you do with gold? I mean, you can use it as a paperweight. Like, you by yourself probably can't stick it in your teeth and do a fill. You really can't do much with gold. And it always struck me as odd that people would build their economic theory of what must a currency be based on, like, the paperweightiness of gold. Like, at least you can put it on something, and you can't put a Bitcoin on something, so therefore Bitcoin is not a good currency. It always struck me as peculiar.
Yeah, I mean, one other related thing is sometimes people will say, I mean, gold can never go to zero or something like that, and whereas Bitcoin technically could, and yeah, that is true. But I mean, that's not whatever you think the floor price of gold is in terms of just if nobody held gold at all as a hedge against future price inflation, if they just used it purely as a commodity and had no recollection of its historical role as a money, it would be the price of gold right now would be a lot lower than it is.
Yeah.
So again, using their own terminology, gold has been in a bubble for thousands of years. The way people say Bitcoin's just a bubble, and so, but yet most of them don't think, oh yeah, so I would never get into gold while it's above $78 an ounce because otherwise it's a bubble. Nobody thinks that. They think, no, I can get in, and I'm not going to be the last sucker holding the bag for the rest of my life. And so that logic would apply to Bitcoin. It's just the floor price for Bitcoin in that framework is zero, not a little bit above it.
Yeah, it does all depend on your time frame. I mean, I'm the biggest supporter of Bitcoin out there, but a billion years from now, we're going to be using the Bitcoin protocol. I'm skeptical. Okay, so we've talked a little monetary theory side of Bitcoin, which has been interesting. But I'd like to change the line of questioning here a little bit and talk more about the Bitcoin sort of network itself. There's one common criticism of Bitcoin out there, that the mining process to validate transactions and to create new coins uses too much energy, too much electricity, and so it's not a cost-effective system. And some criticisms go so far as to say it's harmful to the environment because you're using so much energy, CO2 creation, etc. Now, I know that you have also done a lot of work researching the energy field. So I'm curious, what are your responses to those criticisms? Are they valid?
I don't think so. And again, I'm an economist. I'm not totally an expert on the pure technical side of this, but big picture to me, I can't believe that 50 years from now, I think computing power is going to be so much further advanced than what it is today. The idea that people are going to be fretting at that point about validating blockchain transactions and things like that, to me that's not going to be an issue. You know what I mean? Like how we take video. I go to the karaoke bar and on my phone I take videos that have a lot more memory probably than a lot of the messages sent by the Allied governments during World War II.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
And so. Yeah. Arguably, my videos of karaoke are more important than some of those things, but still. So again, just showing. I mean, it's inconceivable. And then, as far as electricity, again, I don't think that's going to be an issue. And people are doing things too, like getting clever and saying, okay, in the winter we can heat the house by using the machines that are mining and so on, because it throws off heat. And there's all that stuff. Fine, but even without that stuff, again, I don't think when you look at what are we getting in exchange for it, it's like saying it's a waste to build locks on doors around the world. And yeah, if there were no crime, that would be better and we could economize and not make locks, but it helps to have locks given that the world is the way it is. And so given that there are people who want to steal your money and that it's hard to trust third parties to authenticate transactions and to maintain a money and so forth, if we could achieve the dream of Bitcoin in exchange for having to use such and such megawatt hours of power and so forth, that's, to me, that would be a good exchange. The more people that use Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency of that nature, then we would no longer have inflation in the pejorative sense, and we would get rid of the business cycle. So how much is that worth?
Yeah, wow. So you mentioned just a minute ago the difficulty of trusting third parties, and that Bitcoin, if you read the original Satoshi Nakamoto paper, basically his point is, this is digital cash, peer-to-peer, direct between people, and you no longer have to trust the third party for validation. But the problem with that is you are still trusting the protocol, and you're trusting the code, and you're trusting everyone who's running this software to adhere to the rules of sort of the consensus. And now individually, if they go against consensus now, then the network ignores them. So that's not a problem. But what about the problem of not adhering to the vision of Bitcoin today, a generation from now? What if, for example, I'll give you one specific example, 21 million Bitcoin limit right now. How can you be confident that 20 years from now there won't be a change in the code that removes that and allows for inflation of Bitcoin? Okay,
and I'm happy to hear your guys' thoughts on this too, because again, this is partly a technical. So I will say, I'm going to botch it. I mean, I know recently, like as of in August, there was a big controversy, and I'm sure it's still brewing in the developer community about certain standards going one way or the other, and that I have to say, as an amateur outsider, economist looking at this, I didn't realize that so few people had so much power over what might happen. So I was a bit surprised by that and by the rhetoric they were using and trying to rally troops to their positions. We made analogies in understanding Bitcoin about the English language and things like that to say, yes, the English language evolved over time. If you read something that Shakespeare wrote, it sounds different, but it's still English, and it depends on how basic the rules are. Like subject-verb agreement, that's a pretty strong rule of grammar that it would be hard to change, whereas thee and thou and that sort of stuff, wasn't as big a deal. So something as hard and fast as the 21 million cap rule, to me, that's pretty fundamental, and I would be surprised. I mean, I think you basically wouldn't have Bitcoin anymore if they broke that rule. So I would be surprised if something like that could go through, whereas other things that are more, not considered not as essential. And again, with all this stuff, you can't control what future human beings are going to do. We've seen that with paper constitutions and other forms of government. So I do think, though, that the only possible way you could get something or have some assurance is a system like Bitcoin, where it's a whole community interacting, and there's a genuine consensus that typically has to emerge, and it's regulated in that sense. But yeah, I mean, if tomorrow every single person who runs mining operations or wherever decides we're going to have 42 million Bitcoins, I can't do anything now to stop them from doing that. It's just the incentives really are such that I doubt they would. Just like I really don't think anytime in the near future or even beyond, grammar books are going to say don't worry about subject-verb agreement. I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and especially based on recent events. So I think Bitcoin enthusiasts have a tendency to really romanticize and say, like, this is it. We have arrived. Bitcoin is the thing that's going to break the state, and it's perfect, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. But I think, don't get me wrong, I think it's amazing, and I think there's some truth to that. But for those who have been following the Bitcoin world, recently there's been a big discussion about the block size, which is just a technical unit which is kind of essential to how Bitcoin actually functions. And there's this trade-off, or supposed trade-off, between the scalability of Bitcoin and the centralization and decentralization of Bitcoin. So it appears to be the case that if you increase the block size, it will increase the potential for scalability of Bitcoin, but it might centralize power, which seems to be contrary to Bitcoin's vision. And vice versa, if you keep the block size as it is, it's supposed to allow for more decentralization. And my own opinion on this is I think the block size should be raised, but what's been really interesting, and I must say a bit discouraging, is to see the debate or the controversy and the unprofessionalism of some of the participants in the block size discussion. I'll give you a concrete example. Kind of a hub in the Bitcoin world is the subreddit, the Bitcoin subreddits, reddit.com/r/Bitcoin. It's like got over 100,000, maybe 160,000 or some 70,000 subscribers. Is where a lot of information comes from. And the moderator of that particular forum and another forum has essentially explicitly censored discussion about a particular topic in the block size. Outright censored, deleting people's posts, banning them from the forum in this really shocking way, which I would not have expected the Bitcoin community to put up with. And I think, for me at least, it has tarnished the idea that the idea that there's no really nasty sour apples in the development process of Bitcoin. Because I don't know what you guys think, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it. Is if you've been following it, does that not seem like it kind of cuts at this idea of the democratic consensus when you have people behaving so unprofessionally?
So yeah, I'll chime in. So yeah, what you're talking about is exactly the issue I was alluding to. And for me, I'll be real brief here. My reaction is, because people were, is Gavin one of the big names? I'm showing my ignorance. Is that okay? Yeah. So I was reading somebody saying, and I'm surprised that he would just go off and unilaterally try to, hijack it. But to me, my reaction was, wait a minute, guys. I thought we didn't have to rely on someone being a sport about it. I thought the whole point of this was there is no such person who can be a jerk. If you know what I mean, that we're not susceptible to even 50 people being jerks and anti-democratic. So that was kind of, and again, I'll let you guys, the details better than I do, but that was what concerned me, and I realized if the outsiders see this, I think it's bad PR if it looks like Bitcoin actually isn't as immune to powerful people hijacking it as, the official story says. Or are those people exaggerating how much power these individuals do in fact have? Right,
and I think somehow both of those have sort of happened. I would just add that the other side is dangerous too, which is not that you have a few powerful people hijack it and use it for their means, but that you may have a small community of people who are so afraid of change and experimentation that they actually keep it, the process for adapting and changing Bitcoin, as it already has over time, so sclerotic and slow that it cannot change when it needs to, which I think is actually more what's happening now. If we remember back to and I've only been involved with Bitcoin really since 2012, but even then, people fundamentally view Bitcoin as an experiment, right? This is a monetary experiment. This is a technology experiment. We're just seeing if this even is possible. And I think at some point, probably correlating with the rise in price, people started to say, this is no longer an experiment. There's a lot of money riding on this now. We need to make sure that it doesn't fail. And I think when that transition occurred, you started to have people taking a very conservative view and no longer view it as an experiment, which I think it still is in many ways, an experiment to see if open source technology like this can create a currency with no backing that people voluntarily agree to use. And that's just on the social sort of side of it. It's also, technically, still, there's a lot of new things that we're learning about, such as the block size debate. So I think actually being too conservative can be dangerous as well. What is the balance supposed to look like? I don't know. I will say, even though this block size debate specifically has become pretty contentious in the community, it's still, Bitcoin itself is still operating relatively smoothly, right, without anyone coming in and doing any permanent damage to the network or anyone's coins being stolen and whatnot, right? So you can see in a centralized system where if you had a strong rift among people who controlled the credit payment network or whatever, it could literally impact the functioning of the technology, and right now that has not occurred with Bitcoin, so that is at least positive.
I think it's also, I think you're spot on, and I think partially it's because people have such a lot of people have such high expectations of Bitcoin that it already is this extraordinary, perfect technology that has no flaws, and so when you have technical issues, I think it kind of brings the image of Bitcoin down a few notches. But there's a wonderful segue to something I really want to get both of your opinions on the topic as well. We're now entering into the pessimism of Bitcoin phase. So recently there's been some stress tests on the Bitcoin network. There's been the transaction malleability issue, which is a technical problem I won't get into. That's been recently, it's come up again. Nobody's Bitcoins have been stolen or anything like that, but it's caused some headaches, and the block size debate has caused some headaches. So what do you think are the kind of long-term prospects for the survivability of Bitcoin when it's not been attacked by governments who've been throwing $1 billion at it to try to combat terrorism? It's just in its own operation, it's come up with these kind of silly issues, and it hasn't had this massive state-funded attack, which I think is inevitable on the Bitcoin network. Do you think that it can sustain such a thing, or do you think that's wishful thinking, or what are your thoughts?
Okay, so I'll jump in. First, let me just say the previous comment that I really like that your observation about Bitcoin was this experiment and it was real innovative, and then once real money seemed to be on the line, then all of a sudden people got nervous. Because you see that pattern all over the place, like in music. Like when it's just all fun and there's musicians just creating for the love of the craft, it's great. But then once they realize a bunch of money can be made, now the corporations come in and they use the formula and let's make a boy band and come. So
exactly.
There is
once
that,
you become a karaoke star, then it all goes out the window.
Exactly. Yep. Now I'm afraid to take risks. I gotta practice it in my shower before I do it on the stage. So as far as your other question, that it's a bit technical for me. All I would say is I think the state already is doing a lot to scare the crap out of people, like the Silk Road trial and things like. So that you're right. I know you meant more of a let's have this a technical denial of service or what have you, massive electronic attack, and that's. But in terms of, I think they really are trying to scare people and not let this get off the ground, because they probably realized if we can just kill this thing in its infancy, that we'll probably save ourselves a lot of trouble down the road.
That is an excellent point. I just want to jump in 1 second to piggyback off that, because my wife has been working at a Bitcoin payment processor. Was working for some time, and I'm involved, and I have some connections in terms of people I know in the Bitcoin industry, and I can absolutely confirm, it was something I wasn't even thinking of, that the government is putting pressure not necessarily on the technical end, but on the banking and financial end. So there's a bunch of entrepreneurs out there that are being stifled because the government is saying you have to get this regulation and this licensing, you have to jump through these hoops, and you have to do that and play by these. And people are saying, can't do it, I don't have the money, I'm too scared, I can't, And the big banks who already have the licensing are already enjoying their position as insiders. That you're right, that is already definitely happening to a big degree. And in fact, I think Bitcoin, in terms of the services that we use right now, I think Bitcoin would look very different already than it currently does if the government wasn't so involved in intimidating entrepreneurs and shutting them down.
I will just echo both your comments about the government attacking Bitcoin not through a technical approach, but through a regulatory and intimidation approach, because I happen to be the co-founder of a Bitcoin company, and it doesn't even have to be through directly, right? The government directly reaching out and saying, here's a subpoena or an injunction or whatever. Although that's a possibility, I hope not. But there's a culture of sort of fear about every step that you take, and making sure that you're doing everything such that you're not going to get a knock at the door or a phone call that you're in violation of some law. And that's not true of just the Bitcoin space, I suppose, right? And that is true of entrepreneurs generally speaking. But because Bitcoin is so new and so innovative, and it's not always clear what the regulatory guidance is on it, that's even worse. And one quick example I'll give is multi-signature. That just means Bitcoin is owned by more than one person, and those people have to agree before it goes anywhere. Well, the law is very unclear about how multi-signature is viewed in terms of the law of possession and ownership. Is it technically escrow if you have one of the keys in a multi-signature transaction? Well, don't really know, right? The government could knock your door down and say you don't have a money transmitter license, or they could say, well, you never really directly owned it. So that sort of uncertainty is very harmful to entrepreneurs. Oh, and one quick point about the technical side of it. Steve, the state has such immense resources. I suspect that if they wanted to do some sort of technical attack to take down the Bitcoin network effectively, meaning you couldn't use it to process transactions, that they would be able to do so temporarily. Yeah. My suspicion is that there are enough technically adept people who have enough vested interest in this and enough passion around it that you would find technical ways around it. And just to give an example, if you all of a sudden had 10,000 new nodes processing transactions and doing the hashing power, Gavin Andreessen and others have already said there's a switch in the code that they can flip that basically prevents any nodes with a certain history, like how long they've been on the network, from preventing them from processing transactions. So
fascinating.
They're already thinking about this stuff, and I expect that when it happens, and I think it probably will, it'll temporarily probably put things to a halt, but then eventually we'll get things back in motion. That's my hope, anyway.
So we need to give Gavin more power to protect us.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah. But it would have to be done voluntarily. Right. Fortunately, it's actually an interesting thing you bring up. A lot of people don't realize that miners have a pretty substantial role to play in how they accept transactions. People think that transactions are either accepted or rejected based on what's in the code themselves, but miners actually have a lot of flexibility in determining what transactions are accepted or they're not. So, spam attacks and malleability attacks and all the stuff we're talking about here, miners themselves, even without changes to the core code, can often mitigate these things just themselves.
Well, that's great. Let me also say, I've heard people speculate, and it rings true to me. I think if let's say you're the people running the federal government, you're part of the Bilderberg group, all these shadowy figures. Really, you would want there to be something like Bitcoin up and running so that you could pay your CIA hitmen to go do stuff very clandestinely. You just wouldn't want Joe Sixpack using it in day-to-day transactions, because then it'd be hard to tax them and that kind of stuff.
And that's not really a flippant argument either, because we see one example of this already, which is the Tor network. The Tor network was developed by the Navy, to allow their own agents to communicate around the world clandestinely. And it was open sourced, and now people around the world are able to use it themselves. And people think, oh, the government hates Tor and is attacking it. Well, they don't necessarily want average people using it, but they want to use the network themselves. And so you're right, I would not underestimate the ability for them to have untraceable cache they want to use. And certainly that's probably happening. The Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, Daniel Krawitz and Michael Goldstein, thank you, Bitstein, have actually written about this before, which is the incentives. It's almost like public choice theory. The incentives provided by the Bitcoin network to government officials are such that they're not actually concerned about them attacking it. They're concerned about them adopting it and and using it themselves. So that's a tangent, but that's an interesting theory.
Well, this has been excellent. I think we should probably go over to some questions. I think, Sam, you were looking at them before. Are there any good ones we can
get
a shot at?
My other browser here is lagging here a little bit, so I'm scrolling back up. There's been a lot of conversation, which is great. One question from Derek asks, what do we think the block size should be raised to? Now, that's naturally a leading question because it assumes that we want to raise the block size. There are some people who don't want a block size increase for the foreseeable future. Maybe they say yes at some point. They want to see a fee market develop around including transactions in blocks. I'm more of the camp that I prefer to have things on-chain. I think the block size limit was a temporary measure put in place a long time ago and should be probably removed. I don't know what the correct block size number is. I think Jeff Garczyk's and Gavin's too, actually, both are probably pretty reasonable approaches. Garczyk's is a little more conservative. People that are concerned, Gavin's goes right up to 8. But anyway, I don't know the exact BIP that should be adopted. Probably 100 or 101, but I don't think we should leave it at the 1 megabyte block size for very long.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Bob?
No, I would be bluffing if I tried to say something.
I would just echo pretty much what you said there, Sam. I am a big fan of Jeff Garczyk in general, and I think, because I'm not a technical expert on it, I think it seems totally reasonable that you could go right up to 8 megabytes. But it also seems very reasonable to satiate some of the concerns of people to take it more conservatively. And I think Jeff Garczyk's is BIP 100, and it goes to like 4 megabytes, and then after a period of time, it might go up to 8 megabytes, but it's not even anything set in stone.
Maybe let me just, in case there are people who don't know exactly the issue, is it because it's some? I mean, my big understanding is that the protocol right now is fine, but if we're trying to handle as many transactions as like right now, Citibank handles or something like that, that it just wouldn't work technically. Is it something like that?
Yeah. So thank you, Bob, for backing up. We should not assume that much technical, understanding of our audience. This stuff does get in the weeds pretty quick, but yeah. So each block, which are approximately 10 minutes apart, right? They include all the transactions from the previous block, and the issue is we're starting to sort of get near the current capacity of each block, which is 1 megabyte right now. It's the maximum you can have in each block.
It's 2 megabytes, isn't it? Or is it 1 megabyte?
No. Yeah, it's 1 megabyte.
Shows you what I know.
So the issue is that effectively limits transactions to about 3 transactions a second right now on the network. If we were to scale to something like Visa or MasterCard, they do something like 52 transactions a second. Actually, I think it may be quite a bit more than that. It's substantial. It's orders of magnitude larger than where we're at now. So people are saying, well, how can we actually, well, A, do we want to even be able to replicate that scale, right? Because there's a fundamental conflict of visions, if you will, in how people are viewing the blockchain. Do you view it as a sort of a longer-term settlement platform where you aggregate a lot of smaller transactions into one big one and then settle it? Or do you want everything on-chain? Do you want every cup of coffee being sold on the chain itself? People who view it as on-chain want a bigger block size, maybe 2 megabytes, so twice as big as now, or 8 megabytes, or even 20 megabytes was one of the original suggestions. And the people who don't want that say, actually, we are creating these other systems that allow you to do transactions off the blockchain, things such as the Lightning Network or side chains. The problem with those, my personal opinion, the problem with those is they don't exist yet. So we have the blockchain, we know we can use it, it's just we don't have anything to replace it at this point, and so we need to raise the block size.
Can I ask another silly question?
Yeah,
so,
not silly, but go.
Yeah, I want to just 1 second. I just want to add on to that, so we're very clear. The worry is that as the block size increases, that there's going to be bandwidth concerns for all the different people that are running their nodes on the Bitcoin network. And so the idea is the bigger the block size, the more pressure towards centralization, where you'd have these massive server farms, data centers that are going to be doing all the Bitcoin transactions because your regular Joe just can't afford it. Just wanted to add that.
Okay, great. I know. I understand the issue now more. So let me ask this: did Satoshi and the people in year 2 and 3 of Bitcoin, did they always know? Oh yeah, the most we could ever do is 3 transactions a second. That seems kind of like.
It's a great question, and this.
It's a perfect setup question, Bob.
Yeah, it is actually. So here's. I'll just give the facts. There was not originally a cap on the block size. It did not come with the 1 megabyte cap. Pretty early on in the history of Bitcoin, you started to have people intentionally spamming the network just to sort of test the limits of what you could do. And so they were starting to have blocks fill up with these spam transactions that weren't legitimate. And so as a temporary measure, Satoshi, along with the few developers that existed this early on, put a 1 megabyte cap in place, and they said, in the future we want to remove this cap and replace it with a different system, but for now we just want to prevent spam on the network. Now, what the unfortunate thing that happened is the adherence of of this sort of view of Bitcoin as a settlement platform and not a on-chain platform, took the 1 megabyte cap and sort of, some people would argue, held the platform, held it hostage, held development hostage, and saying, we're just not going to increase this 1 megabyte cap at all, and we're going to use other methods instead. That's what people would say who are skeptical of the 1 megabyte cap. It was never meant to be this long-term addition to the code. So it's kind of unfortunate the way it unfolded.
I'll add too, there are people who aren't even convinced that there needs to be any block size cap at all. And it should be noted, though Satoshi's not, we don't think he's still involved with the project, he also wrote stuff anticipating that you would essentially have the centralization of mining. That ultimately it wasn't going to be this purely decentralized field of miners. You were going to have big companies, big successful Bitcoin companies that were going to do the mining in-house, and you were going to have a centralization. So that was in the original vision for what it's worth.
But to be clear, Satoshi created this and then just turned it over to the community. And so there's also a lot of debate, how much of Satoshi's original vision do we even need to bother adhering to?
Right.
It's sort of like author intent when you're reading a novel. Do we care what he was trying to say, or do we just read it as it is today? Right. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's one of those. Again, to reiterate a point I made earlier, this was just an experiment, right? This was just code that was thrown out, open source, to a public forum somewhere, and over a couple years, a handful of developers started to work more on it, and they put in a temporary spam measure at one point. And because it gained value over time, then it was something that was really difficult to change. So it's sort of unfortunate that it turned out that way.
That's true, but we do have to, I think we have to be fair that I think if you read Satoshi's writing, he was envisioning this being a successful thing. I don't think he was just like, it's not going to take off. I think he was thinking he was releasing something substantial that was going to take off.
That's true, but up until maybe what, February 2013, there were probably only a few
Well, that's true. He
hundred
wasn't
or
necessarily
thousands
right.
of people that would have agreed with that. Really, the price is the only thing that gave this legitimacy in many people's minds.
Okay, what's the next question, Sam?
Well,
Probably don't have that much time. Bob, I'm good. I think
yeah, I can stay longer.
Okay.
You guys are pretty interesting.
Thanks, Bob. Actually, it's mostly comments. People have been going back and forth about the block size debate, forking the blockchain, posting some articles. I don't think there are any other direct questions for the group here.
Really?
I actually have a question that I just thought about when I talked about the price of Bitcoin. We have an economist here, and I know it's a pet peeve of economists for people to treat them as though they're financial consultants. That's not what you do. I realize that. And there are actually several disclaimers in your book saying this is not investment advice, which I'm sure is a good thing. But do you have an opinion on why Bitcoin went from, say, $10 in January of 2013 to over 1,000 in like less than a year, and then back down to around 200 and stabilized? Like, do you have a theory as to why we had this sort of bubble and then stabilization later at a lower level?
I think there was, and I would want to go get the timeline in front, to spell out a more careful answer. But I think it was partly, just in general, like a thing that, this was out there, and it's sort of like Mises' regression theorem, this kind of thing. Well, yeah, how would it ever get off the ground? But if it did somehow, then it might snowball. And so I think it was that kind of thing, that there was a point where more and more people were getting into Bitcoin because the price was going up. And so that's why the skeptics were saying, it's just a bubble. And so, but it's an interesting thing where if it induces people to start using it who otherwise wouldn't have, well, then it's a self-sustaining thing. In other words, that it's not just that they were using it purely as an investment, but if more people just started using it because of the buzz, well, that's enough to get it off the ground and to be self-sustaining. And then also, just because of the environment, I mean, it's eerie almost of the emergence of Bitcoin right when central banks around the world were engaging in unprecedented inflation in terms of conventional monies. And so, I think it makes perfect sense for people who want to be hedged and can kind of see this end game that we saw when the problems in Cyprus and Greece and so forth. I think, there was some of the spikes were when there were crises going on in banking systems around the world, and I think a bunch of people, either the actual affected people who couldn't get to their money, switched to Bitcoin, or I think probably more likely people around the world seeing that and saying, you know what, maybe I should get off my butt and start getting some of this Bitcoin stuff right now, because I don't know that I trust the central bankers and the experts in charge to keep this whole thing running.
It's such a unique asset at this point, because I can't think of anything else, even historically speaking, that has the kind of upward potential of Bitcoin. If it actually can be executed as a impenetrable store of value that is global, I can envision at least there being waves of price bubbles as you have different countries experiencing hyperinflation. For example, you have Venezuela, you have the Russians, you have the political nonsense in Cyprus. You have all over the place. I can imagine more people, and then we're talking potentially billions of people trying to chase 21 million coins. I mean, the possibility for speculation just on that fact alone, I think, is why people are so bought into the first bubble so much.
Well, and that's a natural follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned central banks printing so much money during the crisis as a potential reason why people went to Bitcoin. Well, central banks are still printing quite a bit of money. I mean, the Fed is working on, 7 years of 0% interest rates now? So what do you think the future is? Not necessarily for the price, but price adoption, public awareness of Bitcoin, etc.
Sure. Well, one thing is there's a distinction between the Fed pumping in more, base money versus interest rates. So the Fed's balance sheet has been flat since I think it was like October 2013. So I think they brought in Yellen to be the fall girl as opposed to the fall guy, and said, yeah, you're not going to pump up anymore. The crash is coming on your watch, and good luck, but you get to be in history as the first female U.S. central banker. And so, I think that's kind of the position they're in.
Do you think the people at the Fed foresee a crisis coming?
I could be wrong, obviously, but I believe they decided we're going to not inject. So I think they're going to let the market crash before they would do like a QE4. Again, wow. That's not Austrian economics. That's Bob Murphy's prediction. But that's just, again, from looking at the history of the so-called taper. They were supposed to start it like when Bernanke had like 6 months left in his tenure, and they postponed it. And they started that was when they slowed the asset purchases. Like the last month he was in office, and then handed it over to her. So and if you look back to Volcker forwards, when a new Fed chief came in, within not that long, in all the cases, there was a big crash. Like Greenspan came in, and there was the worst stock market crash very soon after he got sworn in, or whatever they do to those guys. So, just the way I think these cycles work is they come in, there's a crash, they blow up their own bubble, and then they go and write their memoirs and hand the keys off to the next person. Yeah. So I think that there's going to be a crash of sorts for sure, and then that I think I think you'd see gold prices and Bitcoin go up because it's not just going to be a regular the stock market went down. I mean, if the stuff they have been doing, if the public loses confidence, it's going to be bad. And does this mean I know like when Nixon closed the gold window, a bunch of people are saying the end is near, and now people are laughing at them, and so it's a question of timing and so forth. But it's the stuff they have done is literally unprecedented in terms of pumping in money, and so if I had to guess, I think they are realizing we can't just keep doing that forever. We got to let a crash happen, and they're just trying to make it a soft landing. But how soft can you make it when they've done what they've done?
Yeah. It sounds terrible, but I think that gives them a lot of credit that they actually have that level of understanding, because it seems like they've demonstrated over and over that they have no idea or no premonition about.
Well, this is maybe interesting. Maybe people would like to follow this train of thought. I do not think the people in Washington are stupid, and I think if you think about it, why would you? I mean, you say, oh, those people like in the 1930s. The only way they could ram through the New Deal and all the other stuff, Social Security and everything that the government, the federal government, the people in power wanted, was to prolong that depression. If it had, if it had been fixed within a year or two, people wouldn't have gone for that stuff. So I think it would be comforting. I used to think, oh yeah, those people in Washington, if I could just teach them some economics, and no, I think they know what they're doing. I mean, they're not God.
That's profound.
They can't control every last little thing. There's billions of people. They can't, they're building pens and stuff for the herd. They can't control everybody, but I certainly think they're incredibly clever, and they have certain blind spots. Obviously, they're not experts in Austrian economics, but guys like Larry Summers and stuff, they're not bad economists. And I think it's in general. I think it's when they're doing something that looks really stupid. It's not because they're stupid. It's because their goal is not what they're telling the public the objective actually is.
Well, that is interesting. By the way, I think the way that they sign in Fed chiefs is by drawing a pentagram on the ground with blood and then chanting from Keynes' general theory. That's my guess. I don't know for sure. Okay, so I think we're sort of getting to the end here. We should start wrapping it up. I have one last question I'd like to ask you, Bob. You said how you got interested in Bitcoin is because so many people sort of were asking you about it, and it overlapped with your monetary theory research and whatnot. I'm curious, have you researched any other technologies, or do you see any other technologies on the horizon that have a similar ability to advance liberty that like Bitcoin does?
Well, I mean, as far as technology broadly, I mean, I think the internet in general, like just the idea that we're bypassing the mainstream media, and I can't even think of the terms. Somebody came up with I was at the Free Your Mind conference last year, and I wish I could remember. Someone said, we should stop calling it the mainstream media because they're not anymore. Like we're giving them too much. And I can't remember what his alternate phrase was, but I mean, I think that is almost like even we who should appreciate that don't realize just how powerful that is, that we can beam stuff directly. And I can't stress enough, like when there's like that Ben Bernanke, you know, the Bernanke YouTube video that went viral a few years ago, whatever. It's not only was that funny and making fun of him, but the fact that it had so many views, like that's powerful when people not only can look at that and say, aha, there's one other person out there who thinks like me, but they can see, oh wait, there's millions and they're sharing it and whatever, you know, it builds. So I just think in general that ability for people to bypass the traditional gatekeepers and give ideas, because ultimately, you know, we think, not that we have all the answers, but we think the truth is on our side, broadly conceived, and so ultimately the only, you know, there's only a small group of people who are in political power and have that power. So the way they got to keep everybody else in line is through apathy and ignorance. And so, you know, they have to get the general public to generally think the people in charge mean well. And, yeah, they're buffoons and they occasionally make mistakes. And once in a while, there's a guy like Nixon who's a bad apple. But other than that, you know, the U.S. president really means well.
Yeah, yeah.
Once that spell, once that spell is broken, you know, it's, you know, the problem is that's when they send in, you know, the troops.
Right.
But the point, you know, it's even there. How do you get the troops? You know, they have to have an ideology also. They have to believe I'm better served by shooting my neighbors and listening to people in Washington. And so the more people learn what we think are the true ideas, it's going to be harder for them to keep that charade up.
I think, Sam, that you should ask the questions yourself, because I can think of one other technology that I'm aware of that I've just say, I did not say this in any way because Sam is my brother at all. I think the most important project in the libertarian techno-anarchist world is the project that my brother Sam is working on. It is taking Bitcoin and it is creating a marketplace, the free market online. And I just say that I grasped the profundity of what my brother is working on, and he'll give a pitch for in a minute. When I was talking to him in person, and we both understand economics, we're both libertarians, and he said, Steve, we're building the free market. Now that's true. That has extraordinary implications for the future of the world, to be honest. If this project succeeds, it is going to be world-changing. Sam?
Wow, well that's thank you for setting the stage there, brother. I didn't actually mean to end this session with a pitch about Open Bazaar, which is near and dear to my heart, but I will do it anyway. I generally am of the belief that technological advancement is one of the most powerful ways to free people, and so that's why I asked Bob, because I'm curious, you know, to see what's on the horizon there. And one thing I do think is on the horizon is something I work on called Open Bazaar, which is an attempt to create a decentralized marketplace for trade online. So there are no middlemen. The trade is happening peer-to-peer, just as if you were in person trading with someone. You can now do that online, and you use a decentralized currency, Bitcoin, and so there's no censorship of trade. There are no fees involved. I think it's going to be something very powerful for average people around the world, as well as people trying to advance liberty specifically. So I will end there. And I don't know if you guys have any comments or questions that you'd like to get in there, or maybe general statements of things you're working on. You guys have that opportunity too, and then we can wrap it up.
Well, sure. I mean, you just said you're going to save humanity, so let me say, let me give a plug. I'm right now in my offices. The angle's not conducive to showing it off at the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University, where we are. If you're an undergrad and you're interested in Austrian economics and want to go get a graduate degree, we are now, you know, actively seeking people like that, and come study with us and just have a knowledge. So we need all these things. We need people advancing the theory, and then obviously people being able to put the stuff into practice is incredibly important. And I'm just excited about the future.
And I am currently doing a lot of philosophic writing, and not just on Bitcoin, but if anybody's interested in philosophy proper, epistemology, and philosophy of mind, then check out my website, steve-patterson.com. I also have a YouTube channel. And I'd like to say, too, I think the future of Bitcoin is very bright, in my opinion. And as it relates to libertarianism, I see one of two possible outcomes. Either libertarians are going to end up being extremely wealthy because of Bitcoin, and we're going to be kind of this aristocratic class that got into Bitcoin really early, and it's worth $10,000 of Bitcoin. Or we're all going to be broke. Because there's a lot of people out there who I know personally who are like 90% involved, invested in Bitcoin, putting all their chips in. So if this is a great grand plan from the NSA to get all the libertarians on board, overturn the vote, they're doing a good job.
Nice. All right, well, we'll end on that potentially uplifting or potentially depressing note. Steve, I appreciate you co-hosting with me here. And Bob, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate your expertise. So you all have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks.